Good day, everyone. This is Mpupi Moloi Kupe speaking from Zivoli Consulting. We are a Black Economic Empowerment and Enterprise and Supplier Development Advisory Company based in South Africa. Today's presentation is on the recent changes that have been made on the Black Economic Empowerment Codes of Good Practice. I'll be taking the We Connect International members through the key principles that informed the codes and also just highlighting the recent changes that we have observed in the codes. Michael, if you can just move on to the following slide. Before I go into the detail of the slide, I thought I should start by just giving a brief history on what is Black Economic Empowerment and how it came about in the country. I think it's a well-known fact that South Africa's history includes what we call apartheid, which is essentially a policy or a system, if you please, which was designed to segregate and discriminate based on racial principles. So as a result of that, you found that majority of the population, which is classified as black, was marginalized and was not given the same level of education, and therefore, because of the suppressed education levels, had a very limited ability to actively participate in economic activity in the country. This led to the government at the time, back in 1994, making a decision to ensure that the policy framework that were put in place and the environment that was created was conducive to redressing the imbalances of apartheid, and that is essentially how the term Black Economic Empowerment was born. Now, there tends to be a misconception that what we now call broad-based Black Economic Empowerment refers exclusively to ownership or the extent to which you have black ownership in your company and nothing else. I think it's important to correct this because whilst in the early stages of Black Economic Empowerment, this was the key measurement along with the representation of your executive team, the definition has indeed been broadened, and it includes aspects such as the makeup of your overall employment. So this is across all management levels, and also the skilling of the individuals that you've employed. It also measures things like the profile of your supplier base, which is referred to as preferential procurement, and enterprise development, which is really a measure of the extent to which you have developed the black suppliers that you have in your database. And the one last element is socioeconomic development, which is commonly known as, or historically at least known as CSI. There are just certain key focus areas that socioeconomic development emphasizes, which CSI doesn't necessarily clearly define. So if we look at the intention or the strategies of broad-based Black Economic Empowerment, particularly across all the different elements that I've mentioned, I think it becomes clear what the intended objectives of each one is, and these are outlined on the bottom part of the slide. And I mean, it includes the likes of increasing the number of black people that own, manage, and control companies, but over and above that, facilitating the management and ownership beyond just an individual that can buy a stake, but including the likes of communities, your workers, which is your staff, cooperatives, and other broad-based groupings that can become a part of your ownership solution. Human resource and skills development is another area of focus, along with ensuring that you have equitable representation of not only black individuals, but economically active population of the country is equitably represented across your different workforce levels and categories, which simply put is junior management, middle management, and senior management. I've articulated a little bit on the preferential procurement requirement, which is really a measure of the support of black-owned or black-managed businesses and the investment that you make in developing those businesses further. So broadly speaking, those are the scorecard elements that you will see being featured throughout the presentation and the intended objectives of each one. Michael, if we can move on to the following slide. I think before we go any further, it's also important to explain or speak to the journey. At the bottom of the screen, we have the definition of black people. I'll speak to that in a minute. But I mentioned that the new government came into power in 1994, and at that point, that's when a decision was made to principally change the environment and create policies and legislate certain acts, and also provide very clear guidance on how it is that the country was going to journey through this very important transformation objective that was a key focus for the government that came into power. Now, in order to do so, a number of things had to happen. So the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Act was drafted and promulgated, and within the act, it gave power to the Minister of the Department of Trade and Industry to develop the codes of good practice. Essentially, the codes of good practice are what determines the manner in which corporate South Africa must comply with BBBEE. The codes first came into place in 2007, and these have been in place in the market since then. I think it's important to just highlight that within the codes, the key term that's used there is black people or black businesses. It's important to understand the definition of this term, because it's not only on what color is the person that I'm looking at, but it's specifically related to what is the citizenship of this individual. And so for purposes of broad-based black economic empowerment, a black person is defined as a citizen, i.e. one that was born in South Africa or is South African by descent. I think this is an important one to also appreciate the role of descent, because a number of South Africans were in exile during apartheid, and therefore their children were born outside of the country. So you needn't necessarily have been born in the country, but if you're South African by descent, you are deemed to be a black person. Over and above that, there were individuals that were from other African countries that were in the country during the apartheid era and became naturalized during the apartheid era. For purposes of the codes of good practice, they are also classified under the definition of black people, and the argument there is they were also subjected to the same injustices as other black individuals, and for that reason, the benefits of black economic empowerment and the objectives of it should rightfully benefit them as well, because they were subjected to the same injustices. So this definition is important and will be consistently carried out through all the different scorecard elements that we're going to address today. If we can just go to the following slide, Michael. Before we go into the detail of the journey of black economic empowerment in the South African context, the question is often posed, why does South Africa have such a unique policy? I think I've given the context of what is uniquely South African about it, but I think it's important to highlight that if you look at other neighboring countries, particularly in the African continent, you'll observe that there are other similar indigenization policies that are in place in those countries, some of which, of course, have been influenced by the South African black economic empowerment policy, but others either preceded it or were just driving at very, very different objectives. But the examples that we highlight here include Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And you'll notice that in each country it has a different name, but it really is all around focusing on ensuring that the citizens of the country benefit fairly to the economic activity that is being observed in the country. Now, I mentioned that for South Africa, the black economic empowerment journey, certainly in terms of the guiding principles and how companies are measured on it, came into effect in 2007 with the initial codes of good practice. And over the period between 2007 and 2013, companies were increasingly starting to comply with the requirements of the codes of good practice. However, the government observed that in certain instances there was some abuse of the policy, and there were gaps in the policy that were resulting in companies being able to inflate the points that they were achieving. And there was also a missed opportunity in terms of alignment with other developmental policies. So in 2013, the country took stock of what had happened between 2007 and the time, and a decision was made to look at overhauling the BBBEE landscape, and specifically at what changes needed to be reflected not only in the codes of good practice themselves, but also in the BBBEE Act, to make sure that the Act becomes the overarching and governing principle on all things related to black economic empowerment. So the key changes that were made to the two documents that I've mentioned are highlighted below, which is really just giving the BEE Act teeth so that it is able to criminalize certain conduct that was being observed while companies were aiming to comply with the requirements of the codes, and also giving effect to the revisions that were warranted in the codes themselves. The focus of today's presentation is really going to be on the key changes or the new landscape post the revision of the codes. On the following slide, we thought it makes sense to just highlight what the code scorecard looked like before and what it looks like now. In the old codes, there were 7 scorecard elements, and each scorecard element had a different weighting, and the sum of the weightings added up to 100. When a verification agency comes to verify your organization, your score would be determined by these 7 scorecard elements. And essentially what you would achieve would be measured out of 100. You will notice that when you look at the 2013 scorecard, the weighting has increased slightly, and the total is no longer 100, but is indeed 109. And over and above that, what has happened with the revised codes is the number of scorecard elements has reduced from 7 to 5. How this happened is management control and employment equity were merged into one scorecard element, and the same was done for preferential procurement and enterprise development. So essentially what's happened is we have still kept the same principles and objectives that we're driving towards, but the way these are measured is just reclassified. One of the biggest reasons for this is there was a decision that was made to focus on certain scorecard elements, and the view was that the weighting needed to be reflective of the scorecard elements that going forward the country needed to focus on. And if you just look at the 2013 weighting, it's very clear that it's ownership, skills development, and enterprise and supplier development. As we go through the presentation, and I highlight some of the principles that informed the key changes that you see, it'll become clear why the focus was specifically on these 3 scorecard elements versus all the others that are still included on there. Before we do that, though, I think it's important to just essentially start at the end and work our way backwards. And when I say that, it's to say, so what do the different points that one achieves mean, and how does my client then make use of my points or the level that I've achieved? So on the next slide, I just outlined the different levels and the corresponding points. So even though the weighting is currently out of 109, essentially the percentage is always going to be out of 100. So I think for purposes of this, let's first start with what we have on the far right, which is the range of the points that you can achieve when you're being rated. So the points that you achieve translates into a level, and the level is essentially what's communicated on your B certificate. So let's say, for example, in fact, I will go into the example on the next slide. I think before we move away from this slide, the only thing I want to emphasize is that at a minimum, it's important for a company to strive to be regarded or viewed as a good contributor. And you will notice that a good contributor is either a level 4 or a level 5 achievement, which is anything between 80 points and 90 points. So essentially what is going to reflect on your certificate is that information, and that is the information that your client or whomever you provide your certificate to then uses to calculate, to do the necessary calculations. On slide 6, I thought it was important just to take you through an example of simply how this would work. So there are 2 examples that we discuss here. So in the first example, company A procures a service, or it could be a product, to the value of 100 Rand from company B. In this instance, the company has a level 5 contributor. So if we go to the table on the left-hand side, you will see that a level 5 contributor is an 80% BEE recognition. What this means is for every Rand that you spend with that company that has a level 5 level, you can only recognize 80% of that spend. So if you spend 100 Rand with that company, you will be able to claim for BEE purposes 80 Rand of that. However, if that company had a higher level, let's say a level 3 contributor, for every Rand that you spend, you will see that if it's a level 3, the recognition level is 110%. You will be able to recognize 110 Rand of the 100 Rand. So it's clear that in the first example, if you just take the 80 and you divide it by the 100, you're only going to be 80. You're going to achieve 80% of what you could have. But if you take the 110 of the second example and you divide it by 100, you're going to achieve 110% of what you could have. So it works in your favor to have a procurement relationship with suppliers that have a higher BE level. On the following slide, what we have here is essentially on an annual basis, KPMG, since the codes were gazetted, has done an annual review that gives a snapshot view of how we're doing as a country. You may wonder why we then have a 2006 one when the codes clearly came into effect in 2007. In fact, the 2006 base that we have here is an exercise that was done by the Department of Trade and Industry, which is the custodian of the BBBE Codes of Good Practice. They did this exercise when they were in the final stages of firming up the Codes of Good Practice, and for them, it was also just a dipstick analysis to get a sense of what we look like as a country at the time. You will, of course, notice that over the years, we have generally progressed on our performance on the code, with 2011 being our best performance over the period. I think, in my view, one of the reasons why you see the results are what they are in 2007. 2011 is a result of how the economy was behaving. You'll recall that 2010 we had the World Cup in South Africa, so the economy was booming and there was a lot of spend in the market. And for that reason, my view is companies could afford to channel funds to the right initiatives for the right reasons because it was commercially attractive at the time. And we have slightly declined over the period. But I think this helps to just give a sense of how we as a country have progressed, or at least we look like, over the periods that the codes have been in place. On the next slide, slide 8, I talked a little bit earlier around the reasons why we stopped and took stock in 2013, and the revised codes were then issued. I think that one of the biggest motivations here was the misalignment with other policies that were in place in the country that were also driving the objective of general development. The examples of these are the National Development Plan, the Industrial Policy Action Plan, and the National Growth Path. All of these, if you look at what is the underlying principles of each, is job creation, localization, and of course skills development, supplier development, and enterprise development. So they're all focused on creating an enabling environment that is targeted specifically towards the skilling of individuals in the economy, but also of small businesses in the economy. And this then presented an opportunity to say, okay, so how closely do the codes of good practice on BBBE reflect all these other principles? And if not, how do we make sure that there's alignment amongst the various policies so that they don't contradict each other and they don't become competing priorities, but they leverage each other to whatever extent is possible? So that is why earlier on I mentioned that you will see that the weighting has shifted to be in alignment with these broad objectives that we've got here. I did mention that in terms of the Act itself, the Act has been elevated so that if there's any other policies or acts that are in place that conflict what is in the BBBE Act, the BBBE Act is an overarching act, and so guidance must then be taken from that. Another critical change is, of course, the criminalization of the practice of fronting, which is fronting, if one was to try and define it, is really a reflection of deliberately manipulating numbers or information in order to give an impression that is inaccurate. So that was quite prevalent in the market, so it was important to criminalize that. I talked a little bit around the alignment of the principles of the codes with other broader government objectives, but also it was important to incentivize companies to then invest in those objectives that were being elevated across different policies. So that's essentially what informed what we now have as the revised codes of good practice, which came into effect in 2013 and shall remain in place for the foreseeable future. On the following slide, I expand a little bit further on how all of this translates into the general principles of the codes. So if we can just go to slide 9. Okay, so in addition to what I've addressed so far, one of the other changes that was made is that the points that a company needs to achieve in order to be awarded a certain level have increased. In other words, not only have the principles that you see in the revised codes changed, but also for you to achieve a certain level, you're now required to have a lot more points than what you were required to do previously. This obviously makes it that much more difficult. Another principle that has been introduced is what is called priority elements. Now, priority elements, and it's no surprise that it's those elements that I mentioned, have been elevated points-wise, which is ownership, skills development, and enterprise and supplier development. Priority elements are those ones that are almost the non-negotiables. So if you do nothing else on the codes, make sure you do these ones, because for the country, this is the priority. In order to drive businesses to behave or to respond accordingly, there's a requirement that for each priority element, a company must at least score 40% of the sub-minimum. So if the target is 20, you must at least score 40% of that target. If you don't, whatever points you achieve in your overall rating that translates into a level, so let's say, for example, you end up as a level 4, that level will be discounted one level. So you will then, on your BE certificate, be regarded as a level 5 because of your inability to have met at least 40% of the sub-minimum of ownership, skills development, and enterprise and supplier development. Another change that needs to just be highlighted is the different thresholds classify businesses into different segments. So we've got 3. We've got exempt micro enterprises, qualifying small enterprises, and then what's regarded as large enterprises. Essentially, your turnover dictates or informs how you will be rated. So if you make less than 10 million turnover, you're regarded as an exempt micro enterprise. In this case, you have a deemed level. So you're not required to incur the expense of going through the rating. The logic here is small businesses are already challenged with the cost of compliance. So to require for them to also then spend money on being rated just make compliance that much more expensive. So to the extent that you make less than 10 million rand turnover, you are deemed a certain level, and you only need to issue an affidavit so you don't have to go through the rating process. The minute you make between 10 and 50 million turnover, you're classified as a qualifying small enterprise, and you're required to comply with all the scorecard elements. However, the compliance requirements are less stringent for qualifying small enterprises than they are for large enterprises. If you were to look at the codes of good practice in totality, you will notice that there's different chapters in there that cover the compliance requirements for large enterprises and the compliance requirements for qualifying small enterprises. And the reason for this is really because the large enterprises have more stringent qualifying requirements. I've already addressed the sub-minimum and discounting principles, which is really around the impact of not being able to meet the 40% sub-minimum for the priority elements. We've spoken to that earlier on in the slide, so I won't dwell too much on this. I think at this point I'll ask that we go to the following slide. On the next slide, it's just a snapshot of all the different scorecard elements and the changes that have been made in terms of targets. Earlier on, I spoke to the weighting. So the weighting is really your measurement out of 100, but your targets are all the different sub-elements that form part of that scorecard element that you have to achieve. When we go into the different scorecards, you will notice that on there I will go into the detail of what the achievement of each target translates into in terms of weighting, and it will start stacking up on how we get to the measurement on the weighting. So on here, I think the only thing I really want to highlight is the changes that you see on skills development and enterprise development. If we start with skills development, I think the biggest change is that the target has doubled. Previously, a company had to spend 3% of its payroll on upskilling its staff members. It is now 6% of payroll. But I think the important thing there to highlight is not only are companies now rewarded for upskilling their staff, but they're also incentivized to upskill other members that are not necessarily within their staff complement. The objective here is to increase the ability of unemployed individuals to become more employable, and that is why the target has effectively been doubled. If you just go down to enterprise development, in the previous codes, the term enterprise development was used to cover any development initiatives that a company embarks on that are targeted at supporting small businesses. A distinction was not made between those that are in your supply chain and those that are not in your supply chain. And what we found is a lot of companies supported small businesses that were not in their supply chain and small businesses that it was not possible for them to establish a procurement relationship with. And, of course, the measure of success for small businesses is the extent to which they have access to markets. So even if you do develop that business, if they're unable to then have access to markets, their ability to succeed is still very suppressed. So the distinction was then drawn between enterprise development and supplier development purely to then take the focus onto supplier development, because if you develop a supplier, you're better able to increase the value of the procurement opportunity that you afford to them and therefore give them the much-needed access to markets. That's the biggest challenge for small businesses. The detail of all the other scorecard elements I think we'll go into as we cover each individual scorecard. So on the following slide, we cover the key principles of what you see in the first scorecard element, which is ownership. The measure of ownership, simply put, is the extent to which you have black shareholders. The target there is 25.1%. And it's not only the measure of the economic interest, i.e. the value of the shares, but it also looks at how many voting rights do they have and what is the net value. In other words, of the 25% or whatever the percentage is that the black shareholder holds, how much of that shareholding does not have debt on it? So that is actually, for purposes of the sub-minimum principle, what is measured on to ensure, for purposes of the sub-minimum element, we specifically look at net value and not the overall ownership scorecard in determining whether the company has met its sub-minimum or not. The reason why the focus is on net value is because a lot of black shareholders that acquired shares in big organizations found themselves with such complicated loan structures that they were essentially going to be paying back those shares into perpetuity. So in truth, they never really owned the shares. So value was never really created in the hands of black people. So it was important to put the principle down to say, the minute you acquire shares, even if you do it through a loan structure, it must be structured in such a manner that over the period of your shareholding, you must be able to pay back that debt and realize value in the shares that you hold. Now, that's the way ownership normally happens in business. However, when the codes were introduced, a number of multinationals approached the DTI and expressed that because they are a global organization, they cannot do local ownership in any of the countries that they operate in. So if they were to try and be measured on ownership in the typical sense that we had in mind, they were always going to score 0. So there was a request for the DTI to consider an alternative for multinationals that are unable to conclude ownership deals. On the back of this, the DTI introduced what is called equity equivalence programs. Now, equity equivalence says you don't have to do an ownership deal, but you must do initiatives that are focused on our key areas. What are these key areas? Again, skills development, enterprise development, and lastly, research development. The reason for this is because even in the absence of ownership, it still empowers individuals and small businesses and propels them into the economy and positions them well to they themselves become bigger organizations that can start to address challenges such as job creation and the very high unemployment challenge that we have in the country. So far in the country, we've had 7 successfully approved equity equivalence programs. This might sound like a really low number, but I think it's important to explain that the reason for this is there were a higher number of applicants, but the minute the Department of Trade and Industry investigated whether those companies had concluded ownership deals in any other countries, a lot of the time you find that they had. And so the argument for the department was, if you were able to do an ownership deal in another country, then surely you can do an ownership deal in our country, and therefore we cannot consider your application for equity equivalence. Later on, after I go through the detail of the ownership scorecard, we're going to discuss a little bit around what are you required to submit to the DTI when making an application for an equity equivalence program approval. If we can just go on to the following slide, Michael. So previously I talked around weighting points, and I also talked around targets and how the two relate to each other. So you'll recall that for ownership, it is measured out of 25 points, and that's essentially what you see as the weighting points there. But in order for you to be awarded the points, you have to meet certain targets. So what you've got on this slide is just the breakdown of each of those targets and the weighting that is allocated to those. What we start to see on this scorecard, and it'll be consistent as we go through the other scorecards, is that there's specific targets and weightings that are allocated to women. So yes, we want to see how many black people hold shares, but we're also interested to know of those black people that hold shares, how many of those are women. And I also mentioned that for ownership purposes, the net value is the most important measure because that's where the 40% calculation comes in. You will see that net value actually has the highest weighting because what this is this is the area of focus for this particular scorecard element. I think that's all I really want to highlight for ownership. If we can just go on to the following slide. And if we just look at the bottom part of that slide, it just outlines what you're required to submit before you're able to implement an equity equivalence program. I think the only critical thing there is the first part, which is the application for the exemption, and there's certain documents that you need to submit, and the DTI will determine if you then are granted that exemption. Once you're granted the exemption, you can go ahead and implement your equity equivalence program. The only other thing I really want to say on this slide is IBM and General Electric have respectively invested 700 million rands into their equity equivalence programs that are going to be implemented over a 10-year period. And once your equity equivalence program has been approved, you score 4 points for ownership over the period that you're going to have that equity equivalence program. On the following slide, I thought it's just important to demonstrate how the level of impact that having an equity equivalence program has had on the multinationals that do have those programs. So on here we just have 5 examples, and you will see that of all those multinationals, they range between level 2 and a level 3 rating, which is an exceptional achievement. And one can argue that it's largely because of the number of points that they were able to achieve on ownership. Okay, on slide 15. So we've covered ownership, which is the first element. The second element on the scorecard is management control. You'll recall that that is the element that was the merger of management control in the previous code and employment equity. This looks at a number of things. It looks at your board representation, the composition of your executive management, of course your senior, middle, and junior management, and most importantly, the extent to which you have representation of employees with disabilities. Again, across all these scorecard elements, we're looking specifically at black people, the definition of which we discussed earlier on. But I would just like to draw your attention to the compliance targets. The weightings are similar, so we don't need to spend too much time on there. But if I can just draw your attention to the compliance targets, you will see that the targets effectively increase as you go lower down the management levels. The argument there is it's less, the requirements from a skills perspective at a junior management level are less stringent than they are at middle management and of course senior, and as you become more senior in an organization. So for that reason, from a junior management perspective, one should be able to employ more black people and less so at middle, less so at senior, and so on and so forth. The only other important thing I want to highlight on this slide is while on the scorecard here we use the term black, in the revised codes there's also a requirement that the staff complement must be representative of the economically active population. So the economically active population is classified as African, colored, Indian, and of course white. But for purposes of the code, what matters is what's your representation of African, what's your representation of colored, and what's your representation of Indian, so that it's also fair across those racial classifications within the definition of black. On the following slide, we have the skills development scorecard. Earlier on, I highlighted that the skills development is probably the one where the targets increased the most, with an increase of 3% to 6%, but the beneficiary base was also broadened to not only be limited to your staff, but to also include other black people. And similar to what we've seen with the other elements, it looks at both what you spend with black people, but also with black females. Over and above that, we have what we call a learnership, apprenticeship, and internship. The objective of this is to say sometimes you have people that either complete high school or complete a degree or any other post-high school qualification, and you find that they are still unemployed. In order for them to become more employable, it's important for them to gain some level of work experience. So learnerships, internships, and apprenticeships offer the opportunity for companies to employ those individuals typically over a 12-month period and enable them to gain the work experience that would then put them in a position to secure a permanent job. So companies are also rewarded for doing learnerships. In addition, they're of course given bonus points for absorbing their own learners, because the measure of a success of a learnership is the extent to which the person can then become employed. So if you as a company are able to employ all your learners, you get a very generous 5 points for that. I think it's important to just highlight that if you're unable to absorb those learners in your own company, but they're able to secure other employment, particularly in your industry, you are still awarded those points. And because it means that there was relevance in your learnership and it resulted in them being able to get a job. On the following slide, we have the Enterprise and Supplier Development Scorecard. This is made up of preferential procurement, supplier development, and enterprise development. At a preferential procurement level, it's really just reflective of what is the level that your supplier has achieved and how does that stack up in you working towards your compliance target. The example that you gave, that we used earlier, you'll recall it was 100 Rand spend in scenario 1. They were a level 5, which then gave you the 80%. So essentially, if all your suppliers were a level 5, you should still comfortably be able to achieve your compliance target. But you'll notice that there are other sub-elements in there. The first one being the qualifying small enterprise, which is the companies that make between 10 and 50 million. They have an important role to play in the economy, so there's a specific sub-element for them. And then, of course, your exempt micro-enterprise, the ones that make less than 10 million, they also have a specific role in the economy, and so companies are rewarded for supporting them. The last two is companies that are 51% black-owned and companies that are 30% black women-owned. You'll notice that there, companies that are 51% black-owned have the highest weighting, and it's really around just the consistency that you've seen throughout the code, where it's targeted at supporting black businesses and black individuals, and that is why that sub-element has the highest weighting. There are some bonus points that are awarded there, and then supplier development, as I mentioned, the target there is 2%, higher than what we see on enterprise development, and the weighting similarly is 10% higher than what we see on enterprise development, because again, it's more important to develop a small business that you can establish a procurement relationship with, because the biggest challenge small businesses experience is access to markets. And then there are some bonus points that are awarded for the extent to which one moves from being your enterprise development beneficiary to a supplier development, and also the number of jobs that you created as a result of that. The last scorecard element, which is the easiest to deal with, fortunately, is on the following slide, and that is socioeconomic development. I think the easiest way to explain socioeconomic development is to liken it to corporate social investment, because it's such a well-known term. However, with socioeconomic development, the focus is on the ability, so the investment that you make towards socioeconomic development is required to enable the beneficiary to be able to become more economically active. So it can't just be any initiatives that would be covered broadly if we're looking at corporate social investment, but it has to be an initiative that specifically has the objective of ensuring that the person is able to become more economically active as a result. So that's the measure of success for socioeconomic development. So it almost becomes a subsector of corporate social investment. But the sum of all of these scorecard elements is really what then becomes the points that you achieve and the level that you are then awarded, assuming that you meet all your sub-minimum requirements. For me, that wraps up the presentation. On the following slide, we just suggest talking about next steps. But I think, from my perspective, the next steps for anybody that has had the privilege of being able to go through the presentation or indeed listen in on the recording would be to contact us so that we can engage you a little bit further on any questions that you have. I'm happy for you to drop a mail, or we can have a call or any other platform that would work best to engage further on questions for clarity or if you require any other assistance. The next two slides just give a profile of myself, Mpupi, who has taken you through this call today, but also my business partner, who is the other half of Zivoli Consulting, which is, if I can just highlight, not only a black-owned business, but a black woman-owned business that has been in the space since 2008, providing advisory services across different industries, local companies and multinationals. And I think between the two of us, we bring a very good balance of skills and a wealth of experience in the sector that we would gladly like to share with anybody that requires our services. On the last slide, we do give all our details. Both our email addresses are there and both our phone numbers are there, both the office phone and, of course, our mobiles. So please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or if you require us to engage further on the topic. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mpho.